Welcome, everybody, to today's webinar about managing global mobility amid the chaos of COVID-19. I hope that you are safe and healthy. I'm Stephen Crine, President and CEO of the Canadian Employee Relocation Council, and I'll moderate the discussions today. We did try to host the webinar live a little earlier this afternoon, but technical difficulties with the audio prevented us from getting that webinar to you. Our sincere apologies for that, and I hope that this recording will assist you in learning more about how companies are managing global mobility. As we know, this is a very trying time for all of us, and most importantly for our employees and their families. It goes without saying, I think, that the importance of an employer's duty of care at this time has perhaps never been greater. There is tremendous interest in the discussions. We have participants from around the globe. We've received a lot of questions that we'll get to, and as we all know, the situation is changing rapidly, and we'll do our very best to provide you with the most up-to-date information through today's session. And we'll also be increasing the content on the CERC website so that you can get access to more information about how companies are managing their global mobility programs during this time. For today's event, we'll review the results of the CERC COVID-19 survey, and that provides some insights into how companies are managing their global mobility programs. I would like to thank our sponsor for their support in presenting today's session and for providing the delivery platform and helping us to coordinate and to present the webinar today. As I said, we'll be looking at the results of the CERC survey in a moment, and then we'll be switching it to our presenters from E&Y, and they'll walk through the workforce and mobility considerations, the immigration and tax perspectives, and then we certainly have a number of questions that we'll be covering off at the end of the session this afternoon. And our speakers from E&Y, the team from E&Y, were joined by Roxanne Israel. She's an immigration engagement partner in Calgary. And we have Joanne Van Strien. She's a partner in the E&Y's Mobility Tax Services in Toronto. And as you can see, they've got lots of experience to share. And our third speaker is Daryl Wright. And Daryl has most recently joined E&Y, I think, over the last 2 to 3 weeks, and has lots of experience in the area of human resources management and leadership. So that's our panel for this afternoon. I wanted to share with you initially to help set some of the scene in terms of how companies are reacting. CERC conducted a COVID-19 impact on business travel and relocation survey in February. And then because of the rapidly changing situation, we conducted a second survey, which we launched around the 5th of March. And we're showing you some of the preliminary results from that survey today. The survey is still open, but this will give you a bit of a snapshot in terms of how things are moving and what companies are doing. As I said, the survey was conducted it was March the 12th to March the 18th, so very condensed period of time. We have about 29 organizations in this summary. There are more than that now. As I said, the survey is still open. And there were 100% of the organizations have communicated information to employees about how they can protect themselves when traveling, and providing travel advisory information on an ongoing basis. So we were trying to get a sense in terms of how concerned companies are about the potential impact of the virus on employee relocations and business travelers, and tracking from the survey that we did at the end of February. That extremely concerned number has certainly shifted upwards significantly by over 20% in terms of the number of the level of concern. On a scale of 1 to 5, it's coming in around 4.3. So definitely a lot of concern about this issue. In terms of the steps that organizations are taking to mitigate the risk, certainly the imposition of the 14-day self-isolate from home for employees who have recently traveled or returned from affected areas, and that includes both personal and business. In the previous survey, that number was around 50%. So we've certainly seen an increase in that, and we're also seeing ongoing measures to cancel travel attendance at client meetings and conferences. In terms of travel restrictions, we've certainly seen in the first survey that we did, Singapore, Japan, Hong Kong, and China, those were covered for sure, but we added Italy, Iran, and the Republic of South Korea into this survey, and you can see that they're certainly those countries have certainly been restricted in terms of locations for travel. When it comes to evacuation of staff, frankly, we've not. Most organizations are not doing that. We're seeing some companies, some firms that are evacuating staff from China and Hong Kong. We'll see how that plays out as we update this survey in the weeks ahead. If companies are not evacuating employees, work from home provisions are certainly the norm, and that significantly increased from the survey that we did in February. We do have a few companies that are reporting early repatriation, and I do think that we'll continue to see the increase in the number of firms that are offering extended home leaves during this very uncertain time. For those companies that are allowing employees to work from other locations, we asked them if they were providing any of these, the following allowances. These were new questions that we added to the March survey, so we've not got anything to track them back with, but I think it's fair to say that goods and services allowances are being provided in a number of cases. And where there are school closures, and this was something that rapidly changed, where schools were being closed in many regions. As those schools were being closed, employers were providing support for work remote or work from home arrangements in order to support employees through that difficult time. So the majority of other findings that we observed, and which we'll talk about in more detail with Daryl and Joanne and Roxanne in a moment, is around compliance with business travel requirements, the issues around immigration, and also ensuring that tax compliance requirements are being met during this time. So that's a summary of the CERC findings to this point, and I'm going to turn it over to Roxanne, please, and maybe you can walk us through now this part of the presentation. Thank you, all of you, for being with us. Greatly appreciate to have you presenting this very important information.
Thanks, Stephen. Hi, everyone. The past couple of weeks have been unprecedented in terms of impact on our workforces, our global and local communities, and our families. I really do hope that you're all staying safe and healthy. Many of you have been at the forefront of the frontline logistics in trying to support your employees and their families as borders have been closing, flights have been canceled, and more of us have shifted to working from our homes in order to minimize risk. The pace of change and our need for adaptability at this time is incredible. Today, we're hoping to provide you with the latest updates regarding immigration and tax, but also put into context how you and your teams can work towards protecting your people, supporting your ongoing operations, while maintaining your values in a time of crisis. In terms of context, can we go to the next slide? The people impact for our global workforce has been significant, trying to address new challenges that wouldn't have even been conceived a month ago. School closures, safety and health risks, quarantines and isolation, restricted freedom of movement, remote working, and ongoing and updated travel restrictions. Daryl's going to walk us through a framework that can help us understand the scale of people impacts and how we can start to think beyond this immediate crisis management. Daryl, over to you.
Thank you, Roxanne. Hello, everyone. It is trying times, and obviously getting on the front foot requires that we are mindful and prepared for the eventuality of a pandemic and a crisis of this proportion. And as all the previous speakers have mentioned, it does require us to be agile and to be able to get on the front foot. We need to be very mindful in how we prepare for a people impact assessment. Obviously, everyone is focused right now on the containment stage. From an advisory perspective, we are looking at this in kind of 3 buckets of stages where organizations find themselves at, and obviously how people respond is largely determined by where they are at in their business continuity plan. But essentially, we're looking at it from 3 different phases: a containment phase, a stabilization phase, and then a rejuvenation phase. Obviously, industries are not in the rejuvenation phase. We're in the thick of it, and obviously making sure that we understand how to contain the situation is the key priorities here. Is protect and transition and enable the workforce. So in looking at that, we take our clients, we look at the situation through a specific framework to say, well, we need to cover a couple of areas so that we can manage the situation very quickly. So it is looking at some of the priorities that are, if we can just get the slide up there again. I seem to have lost the slide link. It's about making sure that we understand the impact, looking at moving people, how do we protect people, enable people, and maintain some of the capability, capacity as it relates to the situation. If we go at it in a bit more detail, some of the areas that we need to focus our efforts on is looking at, and Roxanne mentioned about people's values. I think the most important thing is, as we go through these different phases in these different areas, maintaining high levels of engagement with staff is of paramount importance. We've done it ourselves at EY. The focus is how do we make sure that we engage our staff and make sure that the necessary information goes out so that we can transition people into their remote working places, whatever your business continuity plan focuses on. But essentially, it is about how do we plan for the eventuality of these things and being very clear what strategies and tactical plans are put in place around moving people, protecting people, and then enabling people, and then looking at where are the key areas that we need to maintain from a business continuity perspective and have the right resources in place. Here we would focus on making sure that we identify critical roles, and we will identify critical people in those roles and make sure that those individuals have the necessary capability and capacity to execute against those goals. If we go to this slide here, we look at the people assessment and strategy framework. This is a critical activity where what we would do is we would look at various scenarios and plan against those scenarios to make sure that when you simulate the eventuality of something like this happening, you've got the necessary plans in place and that you understand where those workforce gaps are. And then you develop different plans to manage those potential responses. And then it's about making sure that you invest and that you run people through those plans so that they understand exactly what needs to happen and that roles and responsibilities are exceptionally clear. I'd like to hand over now to the mobility piece of work.
Signees, your business travelers, your contractors, and their families. If not already done, it's advisable to firmly identify your mobile groups, track their current locations, and have a communication plan ready so that you can provide updates regarding evolving public safety or outbreak events in various locations where you operate or where your people are located. Having basic traveler information available to assist with travel arrangements, immigration compliance requests, or urgent accommodation is advisable. Consider having the following available: copies of passports and identification documents, confirmation of current location and contact details, validation of whether family members are together and present in that location, as well as copies of immigration status documents. For those who may not be in their home countries, having a communication plan to let them know of country-specific updates, confirmation on how they can continue to maintain their immigration status, and details of current restrictions and travel options if they want it is important. You'll need to take into account any current or potential physical barriers, exit permits, flight bans, or other challenges. Your risk assessment will need to be updated regularly to account for current guidelines in each jurisdiction, workplace accessibility, can they even get to where they need to be, as well as differing government responses to the evolving pandemic and individual circumstances. I'm going to ask to go to the next slide. In Canada, our immigration officials have been quite busy. The government is focused on keeping Canadians safe and healthy, including all of our processing officers here and abroad. At this time, inland processing centers remain open, with reduced staff in order to respect social distancing recommendations. Where possible, officers are connected and working from home. The processing centers, including Sydney, Mississauga, and Edmonton, are still accepting packages. Unfortunately, many of the immigration service lines, including work permit, study permit, and visitor extensions, can still be filed online. Similarly, for individuals currently abroad, applications can be submitted online, although final processing and the ability to travel to Canada may be limited. Applications are not going to be refused if an applicant is unable to provide specific information or advance to the next step of the application process at this time. A 90-day extension will be provided for them to be able to try to get that additional information and respond accordingly. Most of the visa applications abroad are closing or have limited services available. So for those who need to provide biometrics, this may be delayed. Further, Service Canada has suspended biometrics collection within the country, and IRCC, Immigration and Refugees Citizenship, has announced a 90-day extension for those required to provide biometrics who are currently in country. For those who are at the end stages of permanent residence applications, telephone landing appointments will be scheduled for those currently in country to complete the landing process. Please be patient. Citizenship tests and ceremonies will also be rescheduled, and updated notices will be sent out. Pending applications for temporary residents, including visitors, students, and work permits, will remain in process but again, anticipate potential processing delays. Service Canada remains open and are accepting applications for regular labour market impact assessments, or LMIAs, as well as global talent stream applications. Officers are prioritizing applications, and these priorities may shift. For example, officers may be currently prioritizing LMIAs for agricultural workers to support our food supply chain. It's anticipated that there will be processing delays for LMIAs. Essential staff are in the regional offices, and others are connecting to the network remotely. Labor market benefits plan check-ins are currently on hold, and it's anticipated that we may see an extension of the validity period of new LMIAs coming, in recognition that there's going to be delays in applying for work permits in some instances. As it relates to entry into Canada, yesterday, travel restrictions came into effect such that only Canadian citizens, permanent residents, or immediate family members, including spouse, common law partners, and dependent children, will be permitted to board a flight to Canada, with few exceptions, examples being airline crew. International students or workers who are currently outside of Canada and the United States will not be able to board a flight to return at this time. Those with visas and work permit approval letters will similarly not be able to board at this time. As of this morning, Prime Minister Trudeau stated that the final details of the Canada-US border closure are still being finalized. He anticipates that it will come into effect overnight Friday, but nothing firm has been confirmed as of yet. For today, the Canada-US border is still open for travelers, though adjudication and interpretation of the restrictions have been inconsistent from port to port, and we're already seeing CBSA officers take different perspectives in terms of who's permitted to enter Canada at this time. No specific guidance has been provided yet in terms of what constitutes travel for an essential purpose, though clearly tourism and leisure travel is considered to be non-essential, and after the border closure comes into effect, you will not be able to cross into Canada for the purposes of tourism and leisure at this time. Canadian citizens, permanent residents, and immediate family members will continue to be able to enter Canada from the United States across the land border. However, they will be asked to self-isolate upon arrival. Guidance this morning from IRCC has indicated that flag polling, those seeking to extend their status at the border, is not considered essential. As such, they are directed to use the inland application processes through the case processing centers. Those who travel to the border are more likely to be denied in terms of having their applications adjudicated. This would also seem to apply to those who are seeking a new work permit to allow them to change employers or roles or location. As such, it is recommended to apply inland. Public Safety Minister Bill Blair seemed to indicate that foreign workers and international students who are temporarily outside Canada may be allowed to enter from the United States if they have been solely in the United States for the last 14 days. They will be required to self-isolate upon return. Again, at this stage, final guidelines have not been published, and we anticipate that further details as to what's going to be permissible as essential travel will be forthcoming in the next day or two. For U.S. citizens, green card holders, or those that have a valid temporary resident visa, even amongst the current restrictions, they may be denied entry if they are showing symptoms or are determined to be coming to Canada for non-essential travel. As noted, Canada Border Services seems to be applying guidance as best they can at this stage without formal guidelines, and as such, you may see different responses at different ports of entry. Again, all recent arrivals will be asked to self-isolate for 14 days. With respect to the United States, just today, the Department of State has indicated that all visa offices outside of the US will be limiting services for countries that are considered to be a level 2 higher risk for travel. We've already seen consular offices sending out cancellation notices for appointments and scarcity of future appointments available online through the booking system. At this time, it's anticipated that it will be more challenging for anybody currently outside of the US to obtain a visa for travel. The Department of Homeland Security, over the course of the past week or so, have issued several arrival restrictions following presidential proclamations banning the entry of non-US citizens from higher risk countries, including the Schengen region, China, and Iran. International arrivals are now being filtered through 13 major airports in the US to facilitate upon arrival health screening. Those who are exhibiting symptoms may be asked to self-isolate or quarantine upon arrival. USCIS field offices, asylum offices, and application support centers are no longer providing in-person services until at least April 1st. This includes interviews, naturalization ceremonies, and appointments for biometrics. To date, USCIS and the Department of Labor have not released any further updates around concessions for requirements for immigration filings. As such, the I-9 verification process remains unchanged for those new hires or those that require a revalidation. You can, however, have somebody validate the employee documents in person, and it can be a family member or any other person where that employee is already located and is in contact with. Inland filing requirements remain consistent at this time. I'm just gonna
Hi, Roxanne. Are you okay?
I think she may have muted herself.
I'll just make a quick comment. This is Joanne who actually works more so in the area of tax, but work quite closely with our immigration colleagues. And I'll say the calls that we are getting today are tremendous and outstanding. Obviously, this is constantly moving, and we get a lot of discussions around bringing people home and what are the implications if they get stuck. And so I don't know what to say. I'm sure all of you are dealing with that. And as I look at even the slide that's in front of us now, I mean, there's a lot on here and a lot to take in and to assess, especially as you look at your global workforce.
Yeah, that's for sure, Joanne. And I think one of the issues is the speed at which everything is changing.
Exactly.
We certainly didn't see, just specific to the Canada-U.S. border. I think that was really a game changer for all of us. So I think what we should do at this point, I know Roxanne is dealing with a little bit of a cough there. So why don't we move over to the tax section if we could? There we go. And Joanne, could I ask you to just walk us through some of these the issues that companies are trying to help employees manage around when it comes to their employees and the families?
Will do. So hello to all. So I'm going to provide just some quick tax updates. Probably many of them you'll know. We'll focus on Canada, the US, and I'll give it just a quick update on the UK. And then I'll just other sort of considerations and share with you some of the questions that we're starting to get in this area of COVID and the tax implications. So I want to start off by saying, you've got some information here in front of you and on the slides. These, the tax rules and the exceptions are evolving every day as the world looks to react to this crisis. So some of what we know today, I want to say that there could be further updates coming. There could be revisions. They could come as soon as tomorrow. They could come next week, or they could come in the months to come. So just know that this is evolving. As much as people think tax is a black and white situation, I think there's many shades of gray right now, especially when we look at the taxability and benefits and just relocating our employees in order to keep them safe. So again, I said, we're going to focus on the 3 countries. I think each country is trying to implement some form of relief for its people and its residents, and also doing so in the area of tax. So if we look at Canada, announced just yesterday, they are going to extend the filing deadline here in Canada. I want to just give some strict compliance updates, but in Canada and in Quebec, as many of you know, the filing deadline is typically April 30th. They have extended the filing deadline now till June 1st. With respect to if there is a balance due on the return, for federal purposes in all other provinces other than Quebec, those payments can be made as of August 31st. For Quebec, though, those payments need to be made by July 31st. So there's a slight difference there. The filing deadlines are the same. Payment dates are 1 month extra for federal purposes. If I'm just going to jump quickly now into the US. The US, we haven't got official documentation, but there has been some announcements made, mainly on March 17th. What the US has done is they've, as many of you know, the filing deadline for US purposes is April 15th, unless you would extend, and typically you would extend until October 15th. There is no automatic extension due to the crisis. You will still need to file the formal extensions. However, you can defer paying up to 1 million of the balance due up to 90 days. So basically into July. One thing I'll say about the $1 million deferral of payment without penalties or interest, that is a combination of both what is due on the return as well as installments. So if we have an individual or an employee that is subject to both installment payments as well as has a balance owing on the return, that $1 million is a combined $1 million deferral. So if you owe more than that, which I guess would be a nice situation to have, you will need to pay the difference by April 15th. And one thing I really want to highlight here that we sometimes forget about, as we know, state filings are separate and independent from the federal US returns. As of, I think yesterday, the last correspondence I saw, many of these states have not yet provided any relief, nor have extended their filing deadline. I suspect that that will be coming in the days to come. I'm going to jump now just to the UK. For the UK, for those that may be not overly familiar with the United Kingdom, the filing tax year there, is April 6th to April 5th. And typically the returns are due January of the following year. So given where we are in the calendar year, there's been no indication or mention made about extension to file or payment to be made. We will be keeping an eye on that. One of the things, though, that I did want to highlight from the Inland Revenue and something they've been communicating out on recently is that they have been reviewing their what they call exceptional circumstances rules, and whether the days spent in the UK due to emergency measures or being stuck in the UK as a result of COVID, whether they can be disregarded in the day count. For as many of you may know, day count can impact the residency from a tax perspective in the UK. So they're just starting to announce now that they are looking at that, what they call exceptional circumstances. And so the monitoring of the days is going to be really, really critical here, and the reasons why you're in the UK. Last but not least, so those are just a few quick tactical updates in those 3 jurisdictions. Obviously, each country may be coming out with more just in their own filings and compliance. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about some of the other considerations. And I'm just going to try to flip the slides. Whoops, I don't know if that was me. I'm going to flip the slides to just some of the questions that we're starting to get. So right now, as you know, there have been many organizations that have either been bringing their people home or that have early on, a couple weeks ago, were pulling their employees out of certain jurisdictions and temporarily placing them in another, obviously for safety purposes. And so a lot of the questions we're getting is, what are the tax implications of doing just that? And there's a number of implications that one needs to consider. So I'll give an example here just to try to explain a little bit better. We may have had an employee in China, and maybe 3 weeks ago decided that you were going to pull that person out of China and maybe you temporarily thought they would go into the UK, or let's even say Canada. So you bring them back, and I'd say right away there's a couple things that companies need to consider, especially when it comes to compliance. First and foremost, is that person legally able or legally allowed to be working in that jurisdiction that you've put them to? So if they are already a citizen, etc., they likely can continue to perform services from an immigration perspective. But then we also have to take a look at what is that individual doing. So if that individual, depending on their seniority and what their activity is, there has to be some consideration about, even though you've temporarily put that person out of, for in this case, China, and put them into, let's say, Canada, are we creating any corporate tax or permanent establishment issues for the Chinese entity, assuming that that person is technically an employee of the Chinese entity? So right away, some of the calls I've been getting of late around, are we creating PE risk or permanent establishment risk for that entity by placing their employees outside of the country? It is absolutely still one of the considerations that we need to look at. The other thing we'd also have to look at is payroll. As we know, many jurisdictions leading up to this, short-term business travel has been and will be, probably continue to be, one of the hottest topics. Right now with the travel bans, your risk around short-term business travelers has probably decreased. However, in light of the pulling people out or bringing them back home, we do have some temporary mobility going on, and payroll will follow that. So depending on the jurisdictions they're in, we need to better understand, or as an organization, you need to better understand what the rules are. If I stick with my example of a person that we pulled out of China and put into Canada, Canada technically has a day one of payroll reporting, even if they're only here for a period of time. So there is some risks with this, and I think it's understanding that. Obviously, the country combinations and the domestic rules will need to be looked at. I think right now the world is focused on getting our people safe and trying to control the virus. So considerations around whether there'll be any laxing of the rules, whether it be payroll or even from a corporate tax perspective, I think that is yet to come. And I'm not, I'm not 100% confident that there will be laxing of the rules. What I do think is possible is that we're going to see that if a company becomes offside, let's just say from a payroll perspective, we later rectify the situation. I think the ability for the CRA to assess interest and penalties, I would think under fairness and just with all that's going on in the world, that they may allow at least an exception or to waive those amounts. But again, that is my perspective at this point. It is not at all law. The other thing I wanted to say too, right now we've got people coming, working from home. We have a lot of different scenarios. We're encouraging our employees to work from home. Some companies may be providing certain allowances or reimbursements. We may, having pulled out people from certain jurisdictions and placing them in another, we may be giving them some temporary housing, etc. I think today, again, we have to take a look at what the rules are in each of the jurisdictions for which they are both an employee of and which they're resident of. Is there going to be taxabilities of those amounts? Again, I think it's on a case-by-case basis, and I think we're going to start to see some relief come out in certain jurisdictions. I will just say the US, I'll give that one. On March 13th, the US also announced that any payment from an employer to an employee that meets the definition of qualified disaster relief payment is not taxable to the recipient, both for federal income and employment tax purposes. Some of those expenses provided by statute that may qualify as covered expenses include personal, family, and living expenses, funeral expenses, oh, I hope that's not going to be the case, temporary housing and transportation expenses. So my comment, I think, here is as we are in this state and we are doing what's best for our employees, it's been mentioned about, monitoring the days and tracking that. I think that's absolutely going to be important. You look at the UK making some relief provisions potentially if you're there for, under the COVID situation that's going on. I also think that certain payments being made may become non-taxable in this state of crisis. So if I can make any suggestions out there just to close this part up, is that I think tracking, obviously knowing where your people are, knowing how much time they're spending temporarily out of their home country or country for which they're employed is critical, as well as understanding the payments that you may be making on an exception basis. I think at some point we will need to step back and reassess and see what the governments are going to come out with, and not just from a Canadian or US perspective, but globally. So that is all I wanted to say around tax. I tried to go through this as quickly as possible. I will put this back to, I think, Roxanne. I think if you're okay and your coughing is under control, we'll finish up the immigration.
Sure. Apologize for that. Just very quickly, I wanted to talk a little bit about the UK as well, and just say that the UK currently, we're not seeing formal travel restrictions, although we are starting to see in-country visa applications and appointments getting canceled or rescheduled due to staff shortages. There are general government guidelines around limiting mobility within the country, but at this stage, it's still a recommendation. It is anticipated that the UK's approach to this pandemic will shift over the next few days, and we may see additional restrictions. Many of the overseas visa application centres have started to cancel priority service, which includes the 5 working day processing, particularly in Southeast Asia. We're also seeing general UK visa services being suspended in other jurisdictions as well. As it relates to China, early on, excuse me, Chinese nationals who were in country in the UK were allocated automatic extensions for certain categories of visas and periods of stay. We anticipate that we may see a similar response from the UK for other high-risk countries in the future, but at this stage, most of those concessions were limited to Chinese nationals earlier on with respect to this crisis. Just want to comment briefly as to what we're seeing from a global trend perspective. So overall, again, very much a moving target, but many countries are imposing admission restrictions and limiting entry to their citizens or permanent residents. Advisory alerts recommending against international travel are common, particularly for those countries that have had higher risk, higher number of cases, and that's evolving daily as well. And that may have impacts around health insurance and other considerations as well. Most jurisdictions are starting to impose health checks upon arrival or providing information. 14-day isolation periods are becoming more common. Excuse me. And some of the other global trends are noted here on the slide. I apologize, I'm starting to lose my voice, so I'm going to leave that for you to review, but please note that all of these changes are evolving and changing, and there may be additional considerations to take into account over the coming days. Daryl, I'm going to turn it back to you to touch base on sort of closing things out as it relates to the people impact perspective.
Thanks.
So we're going to switch over to Daryl. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks,
Roxanne, thank you so much. This has been a difficult day, so thank you so much for assisting us there. I hope you're feeling much better very soon. Daryl, over to you then, please.
Thanks, team. And as we just step it up to kind of a higher level when looking at protecting the workforce as a principle in this stage and as a core value for managing our workforce, it's important that we create a safe working environment to ensure business continuity. And here we're going to focus on kind of 3 key areas of making sure that the environment is conducive to a safe working space that follows the regulations, and that we focus on segmenting our workforce and understanding how, when we start looking at working remotely, how different sections of your workforce are able or not able to work remotely, and that we need to cater for those employee groups that are not able to work remotely. We need to plan accordingly. In terms of how we enforce and protect the workforce from a communication perspective, we need to make sure that all channels of communication locally, globally, and regionally are totally aligned, and that the messaging that gets to employees and updates is done in a consistent and regular fashion, and that we review those media channels to make sure that they are driving the right messaging. And this includes not only employees, but all necessary people in the supply chain. That's contractors, suppliers, consultants, and clients, that it's critical to keep them up to speed with the movements and the messaging coming out from your organization. I do think it's important that whilst we are in flux, that we look at alternative measures to maintain a level of productivity and performance. And you'll see that in certain instances, a reevaluation of workloads will take place to make sure that the core essential offerings of the environment takes place. I do think it's important around communication when trying to protect workers and sending the message out that we focus around giving guidance to employees about how would they work effectively and safely from home or on the site that is either got reduced workforce, so that we make sure that people are taking the necessary breaks and that people are focusing on safety in their respective working environment. This is obviously a time where cybersecurity is a big issue and risk, and there will be increased attempts from the bad elements out there on confidential data, either employee or client information. And we would also need to make sure, and we would advise you to make sure that those necessary guidelines and restrictions remain intact and in place. It's of imperative, kind of importance to make sure that employee well-being is focused on. And this is going to be a time where employees certainly need to come first in the focus that you provide. For the simple reason, it's an uncertain times. In the absence of enough information, people make up their responses, and this is going to have a big impact on the engagement and experience employees have of your working environment. So we need to look at how the situation impacts on mental health and productivity. So it is important that we then send out the right balanced messaging around how you can use freed up time from not commuting to focus on development, and then also be able to prioritize family time and getting involved with communities and supporting your communities. It is important that we also then look at the right tone from the top. This is a big opportunity where leadership will define themselves, and that we focus on communicating and disseminating the right information that's free of prejudice and unconscious bias in dealing with some of these challenges. I want to talk about remote working in a little bit more detail. I'm not going to focus on the preparation around remote working. I think everyone's in that current scenario. I do think it's important that as the travel bans increase and self-quarantines take place and corporate lockdowns are happening, we need to seize the opportunity of how do we learn and reflect whilst doing it, and this is where agility and flexibility and open channels of communication are going to be of utmost importance. I know at EY we've got huddle groups set up on a Monday morning, where, for example, the leadership team just checks in and sees how's everyone's doing. It's not to deal with any work-related stuff. It's about personally checking and seeing what's the mood of the team, what's the psyche of the team, how are people energized, and just so that we can create that support and sense of empathy. So it's critical that you structure those check-ins and that you make sure that people are able to use the necessary technology. And the safety and well-being is critical here, and one would need to provide guidance. As I said earlier on, encourage the use of freed up time for self-development and well-being, and that leadership make sure that they are role modeling how to make use of the different technologies, and that they are looking at the impact that this is having on teams and productivity, and being able to take care and motivate the workforce whilst they're in this transitionary phase. It is an opportunity to experiment with new different ways of collaborating and making sure that everyone gets used to the different collaboration online tools and what's working, what's not working. And it is an opportunity to upskill the workforce by leveraging those available tools. And some of the things that one could consider in this time is what collaborative techniques is working or not working, what skills can you build to improve on the use of the technology, and ultimately, how do we make sure that not only from a team productivity is maintained, that we also maintain individual productivity as we get into this new world of work. I'm going to move on to the next slide, which is an area around maintaining capability and capacity. And I mentioned around, how do we plan for and be prepared for the impact that this situation will have on our workforce. And we need to be able to adapt and model these plans to make sure that we meet the minimum requirements of either the normal business operations, and then making sure that we understand how we then allocate and reallocate resources if there are any gaps. So from a scenario planning perspective, this is where, if you do have workforce planning capabilities and you've got your business continuity planning, this is where it comes into play now, where you look at the future workforce needs of the organizations in a crisis. You look at critical talent and skills that need to be maintained, and that's across different key functions and geographies. And that these talent plans are kept up to date and that they're real and live, to make sure that any shortages are accounted for, any surpluses are reallocated elsewhere, and if there are any skills mismatches, that you can actually plan for. In terms of the considerations here, composition of workforce becomes critical to look at. Full-time employees, what's the total costs? And just to make sure that we are managing the data on an ongoing basis to make sure that if decisions are made, that you have the right relevant information at hand. The whole idea here is that when you look at the impact the economy will have and this on the business, you're going to make some medium to longer term decisions, that you have the right information at hand so that you can make the necessary talent and workforce decisions. Some of those decisions around could be, for example, recruitment, and how do you recruit? Do you stop recruitment? How do you do onboarding with people that are coming into the organization? And then how do you fill critical roles when people are out of the office or cannot travel to some of the restrictions that was mentioned earlier? The whole idea here is that, coming out of all of this, there is going to be a new normal. There are going to be different ways of working that will be maintained. I don't think, and our research shows, and in terms of our point of view, that we won't be moving back to what was the normal, purely because there are going to be some better ways of working coming out of this. And how do you do that? And that's kind of where we want to dive into the next phases, around making sure that your talent strategies evolve and that you come out stronger through this process. And here, what we're advocating for is that whilst you are going through the remote working and you reevaluate your priorities and workload, that you start thinking about how do you come out of this crisis, and how do you come out of the situation where your workforce is not only engaged in exactly what lies ahead, but they're totally energized because your engagement and your value proposition is at the forefront of how you engage and how it leads the leadership communication. Here, what we're advocating for is that in terms of evaluating the current workforce capability, you would need to assess critical roles and skills that are required as you've reprioritized the business. And once you define what those skills are, you need to assess the existing workforce against those new skills and required in the roles that are going to carry the business forward. And then you move into a phase of where you identify existing talent and you make sure that all your talent and development plans are updated on an ongoing basis. So it's a bit of a moving target. Everyone's focused on the containment stage, and some people are focusing on the stabilization phase. And but the whole idea is that we need to start looking at how, from a talent strategy plan, that there is a tactical approach to allocating some resources now to say, well, whilst people are in the trenches just keeping the lights on, how do we make sure that there is a grouping of people that you can carve out and say, let's look at the next stage and plan for what's going ahead? Yeah, so that's kind of in essence where I believe we should end now. So thank you for listening. Over
Great,
to you, Stephen.
thank you very much, Daryl. Some very interesting perspectives, and your points around the rebuilding and the rejuvenation. I guess it's fair to say that what what companies do now in terms of how they deal with their talent, the folks that, as you said, are in the trenches and keeping the lights on, it will to some extent influence that rejuvenation and that retention of key staff in the future.
Stephen, if I may, one of the things that we are advocating is that across at most points in time through this process, and is that companies engage their workforce and get ongoing feedback because those data points will become critical in terms of how you manage and lead the organization into the next phase when we want to come out stronger through this process and crisis. So that those data points and the ability to engage the workforce is really, really critical because it'll really guide the actions and kind of focus the teams on where the talent high leverage points are.
Well, I thank you for delivering a very positive message there in terms of let's learn from this opportunity and how do we come out of this in a much stronger way. So thank you for that. I'm reminded of some politician who doesn't come to mind immediately. It may have been Winston Churchill that said, never waste a good crisis, and maybe that's a good message at this point. Well, thank you very much. We had received a number of questions leading up to the webinar, and maybe we can take a few moments to review those with you, Joanne and Roxanne, particularly. I know there were some questions with regards to travel. Before we jump into the questions, one of the observations, Joanne, from you were making reference to the permanent establishment rule that exists in most jurisdictions today, and I guess 2 points on that. Do you anticipate that there might be some flexibility on that? And I think you made the point, particularly if companies can demonstrate that they were tracking people and trying to get as much information during that period of time, their ability to do so was obviously frustrated through this process. Any thoughts there?
So I am not corporate tax by background. Do I think that the governments will lax those rules? I'm not so confident about that. I think what I'm seeing and what some of the approaches that companies are taking are limiting the duties for which that individual is doing in the other jurisdiction temporarily, where possible. So, for example, when I think about permanent establishment, there's the criteria. One can be created just by days of presence. I like to think we'll be through this crisis before, let's use the magic 183 days, because that probably is a number that's going to float around for certain jurisdictions. But the other one that I think that's really important, and it's linked into immigration, is, if you're having someone go into another jurisdiction, even temporarily, what is their role? What are they doing? Is it critical to the business? And if it's possible, if you think about certain criteria that sets off permanent establishment, is minimizing those tasks in particular. Let them be doing sort of other jobs, shall we say, if they can. We don't want concluding of contracts, for example, happening in the host jurisdiction. So I think right now, Stephen, what I'm seeing is more sort of trying to minimize what the individual is doing in the other jurisdiction, at least for now. Obviously, if this is going to continue and they're going to be there for some period of time, then companies may need to reassess that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. As I said, we did receive a number of questions that we received them prior to the webinar. So, Joanne, a number of these are, Roxanne, a number of these are dealing with immigration. And so the first question is, what are companies, from your experience, what are you seeing? What are companies doing for any employees who are currently in transit and have been instructed to apply at a port of entry for their work permit?
Sure. So I think that was probably a more relevant question as it relates to Canada earlier this week, where foreign nationals were still able to board flights. And it does appear that those who were in transit prior to the coming into effect of the more recent travel restrictions were able to make their applications at the border. As of today, foreign nationals who are not citizens or permanent residents or U.S. Citizens would not be permitted to board those flights. That being said, when you take that into a broader context and you, excuse me, look at other jurisdictions,
Right.
that may still be relevant.
Okay. So in terms of I'm sensitive to you dealing with this cough. I think one of the questions that, and we saw a lot of that float in this morning. We'll deal with the other questions in writing. We can do a supplementary, but there seems to be a question around what is deemed to be essential. Yesterday we heard there is nothing really. There's no legal interpretation of this term essential employment. Are you any further along in seeing any evidence of that definition?
So I believe that's still being refined today, but certainly no tourism or leisure. As I mentioned earlier, no flag polling. And we're still waiting for confirmation as to whether existing work permit and study permit holders, for example, that are in the US, whether they'll be able to return or if there'll be another level of scrutiny to determine what's essential. It was suggested yesterday, excuse me, that they would be able to return for existing permit holders, but that information will likely come tonight or tomorrow.
Yeah, I think the latest I saw just before we jumped on the call this afternoon is that it'll take effect at some point Friday evening, and we'll look for some further clarification. Okay, well, look, in the interest of your health, and I want to make sure that you get an opportunity to take care of things, we'll leave things here for today. We will be updating the information. Watch for further updates on the CERC website. Follow us on Twitter. We're constantly updating the information on these links. We've developed some additional information on the CERC website where you can pick up additional information and resources with regards to this whole issue. And thanks again to our sponsors for today's program. Greatly appreciate the support from Weichert Workforce Mobility, and stay in touch on these things. We'll be back in touch very soon. Thank you.